I need to get this off my chest because everyone keeps telling me I'm the problem here. And honestly, that's complete garbage. I'm Sierra. I'm 29. And apparently, I'm some kind of monster because I didn't immediately say yes when my boyfriend proposed twice. Like, excuse me for wanting to be absolutely sure about the biggest decision of my life. But no, according to everyone else, I should have just thrown myself at the first ring he shoved in my face because I'm getting older and my biological clock is ticking, or whatever. Please. I've been with Colton for 4 years, and yeah, I love him. But love isn't everything, you know? There's so much more that goes into a successful marriage than just feelings. I work in an office doing paperwork and scheduling, nothing glamorous, while he does something with shipping and logistics. He's always been the steady type, which is nice, but sometimes I wonder if steady is just another word for boring. Don't get me wrong, he's sweet and all that, but he's also the kind of guy who asks me what I want for dinner every single night. Like, he can't make a decision without my approval. At first, I thought it was thoughtful, but honestly, sometimes I just want him to take charge and pick something. He does this with everything. 2, always checking with me about where we should go, what we should do, what would make me happy. It's like he's constantly seeking my validation, which I guess is flattering, but also kind of exhausting. I mean, I appreciate that he cares about my opinion, but does he have to ask about literally everything? Throughout our relationship, I've always been the one who needed more reassurance about where we were headed. I'd ask him constantly if he was happy, if he saw a future with me, if he was sure about us. But when he'd try to turn it around and ask me the same questions, I'd get defensive. Like, why does he need to know every detail of how I'm feeling? Can't he just trust that I'm with him? Because I want to be? I've always been someone who needs to feel completely secure before making big moves. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Other girls might jump into engagements just because they won a wedding or they're worried about being single, but I'm not like that. I actually think about consequences and compatibility and all the practical stuff that matters in the long run. Between us, I've also been doing what I call reality checks throughout our relationship. Like, I'd create little situations to see how he'd handle them, just to make sure he was really as committed as he claimed. Nothing major, just small tests to see if he'd choose me over his friends, or if he'd get jealous when other guys talked to me. I needed to know that he'd fight for me if it came down to it. I think that's pretty normal, actually. Every woman should know where they stand with their man. Sometimes I'd pull back a little emotionally just to see his reaction, and he'd always come running back with more attention and effort. It proved to me that he really cared, even if it stressed him out sometimes. I keep track of things too, like when he doesn't text me back fast enough, or when he makes plans without checking with me first. Not in a crazy way, just mentally noting patterns so I can address them later. He has this habit of dismissing my concerns when I bring stuff up, telling me I'm overthinking or being too sensitive. But I'm not being sensitive, I'm being observant. There's a difference. Our friend group thinks we're this perfect couple, and I work hard to maintain that image because I don't need everyone in our business. But privately, there are definitely things about him that annoy me. He's not ambitious enough. He settles for mediocre too easily, and he doesn't always pick up on social cues the way I wish he would. When we're out with people, I sometimes have to guide conversations or cover for his awkward moments. It's not that he's a bad guy. He's just not as polished as I'd like him to be. The other women in our group are always going on about how lucky I am and what a catch he is, which honestly gets on my nerves because they only see the surface level stuff. They don't live with his flaws every day like I do. They don't see how he leaves dishes in the sink sometimes, or how he can be totally oblivious when I'm trying to hint at something I want. But whatever. I smile and play the happy girlfriend because that's what you do. By year 3, I could tell he was getting more serious about our future. He started bringing up marriage more often, talking about kids, even looking at houses online, and showing me stuff he thought I'd like. Instead of feeling excited, I mostly felt pressured. Like, why did everything have to be on his timeline? Why couldn't he just be happy with what we had and let things develop naturally? When he'd bring up engagement or wedding stuff, I'd usually change the subject or give non committal responses because I wasn't ready to have those conversations yet. I needed more time to figure out if this was really what I wanted for my whole life. But he kept pushing the topic, getting more obvious about his hints, and I started feeling suffocated by his expectations. So, the first proposal happened at our beach, the same spot where we had our first date 3 years earlier. He'd been acting weird all week, more nervous than usual, constantly checking his phone and being all secretive about plans. I knew something was up, but I didn't say anything because honestly, I was curious to see what he'd do. When we got to the beach that evening and he started getting all sentimental about our memories there, I pretty much knew what was coming. He got down on one knee and pulled out this ring. And my first thought wasn't about our love or our future together. I was thinking about how basic the whole thing was. Like, this is it? The beach again? He couldn't come up with something more creative or memorable. I mean, I appreciate the sentiment and all, but I've seen proposal videos online that were way more impressive. When he asked me to marry him, I felt this weird combination of pressure and irritation. Here he was, putting me on the spot in this public place, expecting me to have this emotional breakdown of joy like in the movies. But that's not how I work. I need time to process big decisions, and I don't like being forced into reactions. So, I told him what felt right in the moment. I said, I want to marry you, but not right now. I chose those words carefully because I wanted to let him know I wasn't rejecting him as a person, just the timing. I could see how much my answer hurt him, and honestly, part of me felt bad about that. But another part of me felt kind of powerful, if I'm being completely honest. Seeing how much my response affected him proved how important I was to him. It showed me that he really needed me, that I had this control over his happiness. I know that sounds terrible, but it's the truth. After I said no, I explained that I wasn't in the right headspace personally to get engaged, and that I needed more time. What I didn't tell him were my real reasons. First, I wasn't completely convinced he was my best option. At 26, I felt like I still had time to see what else was out there. There was this guy at work who seemed more ambitious and confident than Colton, and I wanted to keep that door open just in case. Not that I was planning to cheat or anything, but you never know what opportunities might come up. Second, I wanted Colton to prove himself more before I committed. I needed to see him work harder, make more money, show me he could provide the lifestyle I envisioned for myself. The ring was nice, but not amazing, and I wanted to see if he'd step up his game if I made him wait longer. After the proposal, I watched him struggle with disappointment and confusion, and I managed his emotions carefully. I gave him just enough affection and reassurance to keep him from walking away, but not so much that he felt completely secure. I wanted him to understand that my love wasn't guaranteed, that he needed to keep earning it. During the weeks that followed, I used his vulnerability to establish some new expectations in our relationship. Since he wanted to show me how serious he was, I started expecting more expensive dates, more thoughtful gestures, more attention to my needs and preferences. If he was going to prove his commitment, he needed to put in more effort across the board. I also started testing his patience and loyalty more frequently. I'd be vague about my plans sometimes, not answer texts right away, or mention other guys in casual conversation just to see how he'd react. When he'd ask questions about my behavior, I'd flip it around and accuse him of not trusting me. I made it clear that jealousy and possessiveness were unattractive qualities that would push me away. Looking back, I can see that I enjoyed having this level of control over our relationship dynamic. He was constantly trying to please me and win my approval, which felt good. But I was also frustrated that he wasn't stepping up in all the ways I expected him to after the rejection. Like, if you really want to marry someone, shouldn't you be willing to do whatever it takes to make them feel secure about that decision? The year between the first and second proposal was what I like to call my testing phase. I needed to really understand what kind of man I was dealing with and whether he had the backbone to handle a strong woman like me. I started pushing boundaries more systematically, questioning his plans with friends, and making comments about how real partners prioritize their relationships above everything else. When he'd make plans without consulting me first, I'd give him the silent treatment until he learned to ask for my input. I wasn't trying to be controlling. I just wanted him to consider my feelings before making decisions that affected our time together. I'll admit, I did enjoy watching him modify his behavior to avoid upsetting me. It showed me that I mattered to him and that he was willing to change for our relationship. During this time, I also started developing what I called professional friendships with other people, including this guy Jackson from my workplace who had recently gotten divorced. He was more financially successful than Colton and had this confidence that came from experience. We'd grab coffee sometimes to talk about work stuff, and he'd give me advice about career advancement and life in general. I wasn't doing anything inappropriate, just maintaining a friendship with someone who understood ambition in ways that Colton didn't. Jackson would compliment my intelligence and my drive, and he made me feel appreciated for qualities that Colton sometimes took for granted. It was refreshing to have someone recognize my potential instead of just accepting me as I was. I never crossed any lines with Jackson, but I enjoyed the attention and the reminder that other men found me interesting and attractive. It kept things in perspective for me about what I could have if I wanted it. Meanwhile, my expectations for Colton continued to evolve. I wanted him to plan more creative dates, remember every little preference I mentioned, and constantly demonstrate his commitment through meaningful gestures. When he'd fall short of these expectations, I'd withdraw emotionally until he figured out what he'd done wrong and made it up to me. I saw this as teaching him how to love me properly, showing him what I needed to feel valued and secure. I'd vent to my girlfriends about his shortcomings, but always in a loving way, like I was just concerned about our compatibility. I'd mention how he wasn't quite as ambitious as I'd hoped, or how he sometimes missed social cues that seemed obvious to me. My friends were supportive and understanding, agreeing that I deserved someone who really got me and could match my energy. But I always made sure to balance the complaints with positive stuff too, so they wouldn't think I was just being negative. As we approached the 1 year mark since his first proposal, I noticed Colton becoming more distant and less eager to please. He stopped asking my opinion about every little thing, and he started making plans with his friends without checking with me first. At first, this annoyed me because it felt like he was pulling away, but then I realized it might actually be a good sign. Maybe he was finally developing some independence and backbone. But it also made me nervous because I was used to having more influence over his decisions. I found myself giving him more attention and affection during this period, not because I was feeling more loving, but because I wanted to make sure he wasn't losing interest in our relationship. I started initiating more physical contact, planning surprise date nights, and being more supportive of his work stuff. I needed to keep him invested in us while I continued figuring out my own feelings. I could tell another proposal was coming because I'd been dropping hints about feeling more ready for the next step in our relationship. But internally, I still wasn't sure about anything. I was enjoying the dynamic we had, where he was working to win me over while I maintained my independence and options. I wasn't ready to give up that power by committing to marriage, but I was curious to see if he'd try again and how I'd respond when the moment came. The second proposal happened at the botanical garden downtown, and I could tell immediately that he'd put way more effort into this one. Our friends had helped him plan it, which honestly annoyed me, because now there were other people invested in my answer. I felt pressured by all the romantic setup, the roses, the fountain, the whole elaborate scene he'd created. It was beautiful. I'll give him that. But it also felt like he was trying to manipulate my emotions with all the theatrics. When he got down on one knee again, I felt this mix of power and irritation wash over me. I was impressed by the effort he'd put in, but I was also frustrated that he was forcing me into another decision point when I'd already told him I needed more time. In that moment, standing there and looking at him with the ring, I found myself thinking about Jackson and wondering if I was settling by staying with Colton. Jackson had recently mentioned that his divorce was final, and he was ready to start dating again. He'd made some comments about how lucky Colton was to have me, and I couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to be with someone who truly appreciated my worth from the beginning. So, when Colton asked me to marry him again, I said, "Not just yet." I chose those words specifically to keep him hoping while buying myself more time to figure out what I really wanted. I could see how much my answer hurt him, and honestly, there was part of me that enjoyed the drama of the moment. I liked seeing how much power I had over his emotions, how my words could make this grown man's face crumble with disappointment. It proved to me just how much control I had in our relationship. But I could also tell that this rejection hit him differently than the first one. He seemed more hurt, more frustrated, like he was running out of patience with my indecision. Instead of just accepting my answer like he did before, he started asking me direct questions about what was holding me back and when I thought I'd be ready. His tone was different, too, less pleading and more demanding, which caught me off guard. I tried to give him the same explanation as before about wanting to make sure we'd work long term, but he wasn't buying it this time. He kept pushing for specifics, asking me what exactly I was waiting for and what would make me feel ready. I felt cornered by his questions because I couldn't exactly tell him the truth, that I was keeping my options open and waiting to see if something better came along. After I gave my non answer about needing to be sure, I could see him getting angry in a way I'd never seen before. He told me that after 4 years, if I wasn't sure by now, what would ever make me sure? That stung because it made me sound indecisive and flaky, which isn't how I see myself at all. I'm just careful and thoughtful about major life decisions. When he said he wasn't going to keep waiting and that he was done wasting his time, I started to panic. Not because I couldn't imagine life without him, but because I was about to lose the comfortable dynamic where I held all the power. I liked having someone so devoted to me, someone who made me the center of his world, and I wasn't ready to give that up. So I tried my usual tactics, the tears and vulnerability that normally got him to back down and comfort me. But this time, he just stood there watching me cry without trying to fix it, which really freaked me out. I could see that I was losing control of the situation, and that scared me more than the idea of losing him. In a moment of desperation, I told him fine, I'd marry him. Please don't go. But even as I said it, I knew it was coming from the wrong place. I wasn't saying yes because I wanted to marry him. I was saying it because I wanted to win the argument and maintain control over our relationship. When he walked away anyway, I was completely shocked. I'd never seen him stand firm like that before, and I didn't know how to handle a version of Colton who wouldn't bend to my will. The aftermath of Colton leaving was complete chaos, but not in the way everyone expected. I wasn't devastated about losing the love of my life. I was furious about losing control of the situation. My first instinct was to blame everyone else for this mess. Our friends should have talked sense into him instead of encouraging his ultimatum. His family probably supported his decision to leave me, even though they barely knew me. Other women must have been filling his head with ideas about what he deserved, making him think he was too good for someone who just needed more time. I was shocked that he didn't come crawling back within a few days like he always did after our fights. Usually, he was the one who apologized first, who reached out to fix things between us. I'd gotten used to him being the peacemaker in our relationship, and I expected him to realize he was being dramatic and come back to work things out. But days turned into a week, then 2 weeks, and still nothing. That's when I started my campaign to control the narrative through our mutual friends. I began telling carefully edited versions of our story that made me look reasonable and him look impatient and demanding. I emphasized that I just wanted to be absolutely sure about such a big decision, how I needed a partner who would respect my timeline and support my need for certainty. Most of our female friends totally understood my position and were sympathetic about how pressured I must have felt. I made sure to mention how hurt I was that he'd given me an ultimatum Instead of being patient with someone he claimed to love, I painted myself as the victim of his unrealistic expectations and emotional manipulation. The attention and sympathy felt good. Honestly, people were checking on me, bringing me food, validating my feelings about the whole situation. I felt like the wounded party, and I liked having that status. But I was getting frustrated that some people, especially his friends, weren't buying my version of events. They seemed to think he'd been more than patient and that I'd had plenty of time to figure out my feelings. Whatever. They were clearly biased toward him. Anyway, I became obsessed with monitoring what Colton was doing and who he was talking to. I stalked his social media constantly, looking for signs that he was missing me or regretting his decision. I asked mutual friends casual questions about him, trying to seem concerned rather than desperate for information. I even started driving by places I thought he might be just to see if I could catch a glimpse of him and gauge his emotional state. But the reports I was getting back were not what I wanted to hear. According to our friends, he seemed to be doing fine without me. He wasn't posting sad songs or moping around like I expected. Instead, he appeared to be focusing on himself, hanging out with his buddies, even seeming happier, according to some people. This made me absolutely furious. How dare he act like losing me was no big deal? How could he seem better off without me when I'd been the best thing in his life for 4 years? I started planting subtle criticisms about him in conversations with our friend group. Nothing too obvious, just little comments about his communication issues, his emotional immaturity, his inability to handle a strong woman who knew her own mind. I wanted people to understand that maybe this breakup was actually his fault, not mine. I needed to control how people saw our relationship and make sure they didn't think he was some kind of victim. As the weeks went by without any contact from him, my anger intensified. I felt like he was being childish and stubborn, punishing me for being honest about my feelings. I convinced myself that he was the problem, that he obviously couldn't handle being with someone who had standards and expectations. If he really loved me, he would have been willing to wait as long as it took for me to feel ready. But instead, he threw away 4 years because he couldn't be patient for a few more months. I started planning ways to force contact with him, including showing up at his workplace or at events I knew he'd be attending. I even considered sending him a dramatic letter explaining how hurt I was by his abandonment and how he'd misunderstood my need for time. I was becoming obsessed with proving that he still needed me and that walking away was a mistake he'd eventually regret. 6 months after Colton left, the universe decided to completely destroy my life in the most painful way possible. I found out through social media that he wasn't just moving on, he was absolutely thriving without me. Some girl named Hadley had started appearing in his posts, and it was obvious they were together. She worked as a nurse or something equally perfect and wholesome, and from what I could see, she seemed annoyingly sweet and supportive. But what really killed me wasn't just that he was with someone else. It was how completely different their relationship looked from ours. In every photo, they both looked genuinely happy and relaxed. There was no drama, no testing, no games. She never posted cryptic quotes about relationships or made passive-aggressive comments about needing space. They just seemed to enjoy each other's company without all the complexity I thought was normal in serious relationships. I spent hours analyzing their social media interactions, looking for signs of problems or incompatibility, but everything seemed disgustingly healthy. The devastating blow came when I learned through our mutual friends that Colton had proposed to Hadley after only 8 months together. And she'd said yes immediately. 8 months. I'd had 4 years to figure out my feelings, and this girl knew after less than a year that she wanted to marry him. The engagement announcement was everywhere on social media, with everyone commenting about how perfect they were together and how Hadley clearly knew a good man when she saw one. That last comment felt like a personal attack on me, like they were saying I'd been too stupid to recognize what I had. When I tried to make subtle negative comments about how rushed their engagement was, people started pointing out that I'd had plenty of time to appreciate Colton and chose not to. My own friends began distancing themselves from me as they realized I was being bitter instead of supportive. They started making comments about how I needed to move on and be happy for him, which just made me angrier. Couldn't they see that this whole situation was unfair to me? But the absolute worst part was learning that Colton had gotten promoted at work and was buying a house with Hadley. Everything I'd wanted him to prove to me, all the financial stability and ambition I'd demanded, he was now providing for someone else who'd never asked him to prove anything. Hadley never made him jump through hoops or earn her love through grand gestures. She simply loved him and built a life with him, which apparently was all he'd ever wanted. I discovered that while I'd been testing his devotion and making him work for my approval, she'd been his partner and supporter. While I'd been keeping my options open and maintaining other friendships, she'd been building a future with him. While I'd been analyzing every flaw and pushing him to be better, she'd been accepting him as he was and growing with him. It made me sick to realize that everything I thought made me a smart, careful woman actually made me look like an idiot who didn't know what she had. In my desperation, I made one final attempt to reclaim some control over the situation. I sent Colton a long message explaining how I was ready now, how I'd realized what I'd lost, and how we could work things out if he was willing to try again. I told him that what we had was real and deep in ways that his new relationship couldn't match, and that Hadley would never understand him like I did. His response was brief and absolutely crushing. He told me he was happy with his life and wished me well, but he wasn't interested in looking backward. He said he hoped I'd find what I was looking for, but it wouldn't be with him. The message was polite, but final, and I could tell that I no longer had any power over him whatsoever. I'd become completely irrelevant to his happiness and success. Here I am now, sitting in my apartment, scrolling through photos of their engagement party, consumed with rage and jealousy, but still refusing to admit that any of this is my fault. I'm convinced that Colton was just impatient and couldn't handle being with a woman who had standards. Hadley obviously settled for the first decent guy who came along, which says more about her desperation than his worth. Our friends chose sides based on superficial stuff instead of understanding the real dynamics of our relationship. Society pressures women to settle down instead of taking time to make smart decisions about their futures. Everyone failed me in this situation, but I'm the one who has to live with the consequences of their shortcomings. I dodged a bullet anyway, because if Colton couldn't wait for me to be ready, he obviously wasn't the right person for me in the first place.